This video covers the second half of our lecture on kinship and group structure. And just to refresh our memories, kinship refers to family structures. Family structures vary around the world and culture by culture. But a family, very generally speaking, is any group of people who consider themselves to be closely related, and more closely related to each other than to other people in their communities. Now, obviously, a big part of family then is based around who is a member of that family. And so the basic unit is often defined according to marriage. So marriage figures very largely in our understanding of how families are organized from place to place. Now, marriage is one of these unique features of human societies. We don't see marriage in any other species of animal, although it would be adorable, but only humans are the ones who make these connections between individuals. But we do see that marriage is something that happens in every single human society. It may look different from place to place, but marriage is a practice that every human group engages in and has for a very long time. It's very easy for us in the United States to think about the reasons why people get married, and many of us might consider that romantic love is a prerequisite for marriage. And certainly, if we are to look at movies or television shows or music, we see that there's a great importance on falling in love with someone, on meeting your soulmate, and then the culmination in that, once you have found that person who completes you and who finishes your sentences and whatever, you're madly in love with them, then marriage is the step that comes after that. But romantic love is not a universal condition of marriage. And by this I mean that there are many examples where we can see that people get married for reasons other than being desperately, madly in love. These examples might include financial stability, or perhaps, for some sort of legal status, or also just because marriage forms social connections. So we need to consider that romantic love is not necessarily the highest priority when it comes to marriage. In 1951, the Royal Anthropological Institute put forth a definition of marriage. The Royal Anthropological Institute is a British institution of anthropologists. They said that marriage is a union between a man and a woman such that the children born to the woman are recognized as legitimate offspring of both partners. So this simply means that marriage is when a man and a woman get together, and then any children that the woman has are considered the children of her husband as well. But this definition doesn't quite work in all circumstances. For example, here in the United States within the last year, we've had federally recognized same-sex marriages. So the idea that a marriage is just a union between a man and a woman is now no longer legally valid. We can also see circumstances, both here in the United States and elsewhere in the world, where marriages occur between more than two individuals. So, for example, between one husband and multiple wives, and in very few cases, one wife and multiple husbands. So anytime we consider plural marriage, we see again that this definition doesn't quite work. But we remember the time that this took place, 1951 was a long time ago. And so obviously people who were defining marriage at that time weren't probably considering same-sex marriage in their definition, but they also happened to be overlooking these well-known examples of plural marriage that exist in the world. If we want to give marriage a definition, outside of, between one man and one woman, or one man and multiple women, outside of that, we can say that marriage is, at its most fundamental aspects, a social contract. It's typically a social contract between two individuals, and that contract includes some type of recognized partnership. In many circumstances, marriage also carries the expectation of sexual fidelity. So often when people get married, whether or not they actually sit down and say it out loud, there's the expectation that that partners in that marriage will only have sex with other partners in that marriage. But we can also see that marriage can be a social contract between groups rather than just individuals. In 2016, for folks living in the United States, it seems very, it's very commonsensical to say that a marriage is something that's decided upon between the two people who are getting married. A man and a woman decide to marry each other, and theirs is the only decision that matters. But there are, again, many circumstances in which we see marriages guided by communities or by families rather than just the two people who are getting married. And we can refer to these in some examples as arranged marriages. And there are communities in the world today where arranged marriages are very, very common. So, for example, in India, it's estimated that maybe 75% of marriages are arranged. These marriages are typically arranged by parents. And so parents will seek out appropriate matches for their children. For those of us who have grown up in cultures where arranged marriages are not the statistical norm, the idea of your parents picking your partner for you might seem very strange. And why should your parents trust, or why should you trust your parents to find a husband or a wife for you that you'll get along with for the rest of your life? And how can your parents predict who you'll fall in love with? But what we actually see is that cases of arranged marriage have a much higher success rate than marriages based on love, where individuals choose each other. And there's probably a lot of factors that contribute to this. For starters, when we pick our domestic partners, when we pick our spouses based purely on love, because of the way that love works chemicals in our brains, we tend to place a lot of importance on certain characteristics of the people that we're looking to marry. For example, physical attractiveness might figure very largely in how we decide on who our mate should be. But when our parents are picking mates for us, they're looking at a much broader range of characteristics. And they're really looking for the best match that's going to ensure future success. And so when you have people who are older, more experienced, these people weighing in on decisions that will affect your lifetime, we see that there tends to be more success. And in fact, I was just reading today that in India, where arranged marriage is practiced often, the divorce rate is something around 1 in 100 couples, compared to the United States, where it's over half of the people who get married end up getting divorced. So there's a really high success rate in arranged marriages, and it's probably because when you have this family involvement, there tends to be a more reasoned logic to mate choice, and there can also be stronger pressure to maintain marriages. If we think again about the idea of picking your own mate because you fall in love with them, well, if you get married because you're in love, what happens when you fall out of love? If you're no longer in love with your spouse, and the only reason you got married was because you were in love, then it seems the logical solution to not being in love with your spouse is to get a divorce. But if you enter into a marriage without being in love with that person, then not being in love with them is no reason to get divorced. And it often turns out that when people live together and work together towards some common goal, towards building a family, towards creating a stable partnership, love can grow in some very deep and profound ways that often we don't necessarily put enough value in those first moments when we're meeting mates and feeling those experiences of lust and initial attraction. So arranged marriages have an extremely high success rate for a number of reasons. Now, this is slightly different than a number of circumstances that we can see around the world and that a lot more attention has been called to recently, which are forced marriages. And these are circumstances in which young people are married to individuals that they may or may not know, but they're not given any sort of option. In the majority of arranged marriages, if one of the spouses doesn't agree to the marriage, then the marriage will not take place. But a forced marriage is one in which the individual has no choice but to get married. And if they were to refuse to marry, they would face severe social consequences. They might be cut off from their families, they might be turned out. These forced marriages are certainly a violation of human rights. Everyone should have a right to decide who they marry. But we see that when families are involved in that decision, and when marriage is not just about two individuals, but about two families, and creating connections between these families, there's an incredibly high success rate. In many communities around the world and also throughout history, marriage has also been a time where families exchange wealth, exchange money, or some other type of material goods. And in anthropology, we define this exchange of material goods according to which direction the money is going in. So who is giving what to whom? So the first type of exchange of material good is called the bride wealth, or sometimes called the bride price or the progeny price. This is when the groom's family pays money to the bride's family at the time of a wedding. And the reason why some people don't like the term bride wealth is because it kind of sounds like the bride is being bought by the groom's family. So progeny price is preferred by some people, progeny referring to children. It's the idea that the groom's family gives money to the bride's family because essentially the groom's family will be getting children out of this deal, and children have value. What we see when groom's families give money to bride's families is that typically women have higher socioeconomic value. It's almost as if, and again, I'm going to try to make this not sound like women are being bought, but it's almost as if the groom's family is communicating to the bride's family, you are losing someone valuable and important in your household. You are going to be losing this woman's labor. You're going to be losing her social value, her friendship, her familial obligations. And so here is some material wealth to compensate you for that loss. Now, in the opposite exchange of material goods is called a dowry. A dowry is when the bride's family pays money to the groom's family at the time of a wedding. And what we see in societies where dowries are paid, we see that females tend to have lower social status. And it's almost as if in a dowry situation, the bride's family is giving money to the groom's family, saying, now you have to take on this new person in your household. She's going to cost money, right? She's got to eat, she's got to have clothes. So she's going to be expensive just by herself. And then she's going to have children, and they are going to be an added expense. So here is some money to sort of make up for the fact that you have this additional responsibility now in your family. So the direction that money goes tends to correlate to a female's worth in that society. In groups where wealth is exchanged at the time of marriage, we often see that there are some sort of systems set in place if one of those spouses were to die. So, for example, if a wife were to die shortly after a marriage, and some sort of wealth had been paid from one side of the family to the other, typically you would expect to see that another female member of that bride's family would marry the recently widowed husband. Because whenever there's material wealth exchanged at the time of marriage, it's essentially setting up a contract. And so for a contract to remain in play, for that contract to remain valid, both sides of the agreement have to keep up their end of the bargain. So if a spouse were to die, that spouse has to be replaced to maintain that social connection. So when a replacement wife is provided, usually a younger sister or maybe a female cousin, we refer to that as a sororate. When a replacement husband is provided, we refer to that as a levirate. And in systems where replacement wives or replacement husbands are brought in to make good on the arrangement, then the bride wealths or the dowries are kept by the families who receive them. And this sounds all very sort of clinical, and it may sound strange, the idea of replacement wives or replacement husbands. But just imagine a community where a woman marries into a family. She has some children, and her children are considered part of her husband's family. And then her husband dies. If this is a society where women don't have a lot of freedom to provide for themselves, in many communities, women are expected to take on domestic tasks, and they're not expected to work outside of the home. So if a woman is widowed with a couple of young children, how is she supposed to provide for her children if she can't get a job? How is she supposed to make sure that she and her kids stay alive and stay healthy? Well, in a circumstance like this, it might make a lot of sense for everyone concerned if if her husband's brother then marries her, because by doing that, he is keeping his brother's children and his brother's wife safe. If a man marries his deceased brother's wife, he's ensuring the legacy of his brother's family and ultimately his own family. So, sororates and leverates can be seen as a way of ensuring the success of families. Even though it may sound a little bit strange, the idea of marrying my husband's brother might not seem like the greatest thing to me, but when we look at it in the sense of making sure that all people are taken care of, it makes a lot more sense in that context. We also can see around the world many examples of plural marriage. Plural marriage very generally is referred to as polygamy. The poly part of this word meaning many, and then gamy refers to marriage. So plural marriage is many marriage. It's any marriage involving more than two people. But there are two types of polygamy. There's polygyny and polyandry. In polygyny, we see one man has multiple wives. And this is the most common type of polygamy in the world. We see many, many communities practicing polygamy. In the United States, polygamy is not legal, but there still are some groups that do practice polygamy, and this is typically on religious grounds. So, for example, fundamentalist Mormons sometimes practice polygyny. This is a picture from the HBO show Big Love that was on a few years back about a polygynous family in Utah where we had one husband with 3 wives. In communities that are polygynous around the world, what we often see is that even though polygyny is legal, and even though there may be a cultural preference for it, not every man in the community will have multiple wives. And that's because with multiple wives comes multiple responsibilities. If you imagine this man has his first wife, he needs to make sure that she has everything she needs to provide for herself and her family. So she needs a house, she needs money to take care of kids, maybe she needs land, she needs transportation, whatever. There's all of those same family obligations apply to her. But when he marries a second wife, he has to ensure that the second wife gets all of the same things as the first wife. There can't be favoritism between the two. So one woman can't have a lot of resources and the other woman have nothing. Same with taking on a third wife. Third wife has to have all of the same resources available to her as the first and the second wives. So having multiple wives means having a lot of resources. And typically in polygynous communities, it's only the wealthiest men that are able to support multiple wives and the multiple children that come with them. So most men in these communities will remain monogamous, meaning they only have one wife. So polygyny is the most common type of polygamy, but there are some examples of polyandrous societies, or at least one example. A polyandrous group is one in which one woman will have multiple husbands. And we see this happening, for example, this is a polyandrous family from Tibet. We see polyandry in communities in the Himalaya mountains. This is an area of the world where they're at very high elevation. They are farmers, but there's not a lot of farmland available to people. So polyandry in this society is an adaptation that serves to keep families together and keep families small and maintain familial homesteads. So imagine, for example, that you have a man and he has 4 sons, and he raises his 4 sons on his plot of land that he owns. On that chunk of land, he's able to do all of the farming he needs to provide for his family, his wife, and his 4 sons. But then, as that man gets older, and as his sons come of age, those sons also need to support families as they grow into adulthood. So the father in the story, he could provide for all four sons by dividing up his land into four equal pieces. Now each of the four sons inherits 1/4 of the original land. But what if each of those four sons has four sons? Within just 3 generations, we've gone from one man to 16 men. And if we keep dividing up that original piece of farmland, soon each son only has 1/16 of the original land area in which to provide everything that their family needs. It will be very hard for families to keep growing if they have to keep dividing farmland further and further. And this is a part of the world where farmland is a scarce resource. You're up in the highest mountains in the world, and there's not a lot of available farmland. So you run out of space very, very quickly if property keeps getting divided amongst subsequent generations. What these communities have done, the way that they have sort of worked around this problem, is that rather than all of the sons in a family dividing up land and dividing up property and then each going their own way and trying to raise their own families, instead, all of the sons of a single generation will marry the same woman. So this woman here is married to each of these two men, and these two men are brothers. So they will stay on their father's homestead. They'll stay on their father's land, marry the same woman, and then keep their family on that land. And their sons will also marry a new woman when they come of age. So it's a way of keeping land and property in the family. And you might ask, if this woman is married to both of these men, how do they know whose son is whose or whose child is whose? And the answer is, it doesn't really matter. Because even if this son is not the direct offspring of this man, he's still his nephew. Okay, so there's still very close family relationships. So it doesn't really matter to these men, who is the actual father and who is the uncle, because it's all still family. Now, obviously, this is a very rare situation. It happens in special circumstances, but it does happen. And it shows how often the way that families are constructed is based on the availability of resources, and in this case, land. We can also see how property and inheritance rules affects who is involved in marriages, and specifically from the standpoint of sex or gender. So we know that in 2016, same-sex marriage is now legal in the United States and in many other parts of the world. But we also see examples of same-sex marriage elsewhere that have absolutely nothing to do with the idea of romantic love as we have it here in the US. So for example, there are some communities in which individuals take on the gender roles of the opposite sex, and that's because of how property is passed down. For example, there's a group of people called the Nuer who live in southern Sudan over here in Africa. The Nuer are an extremely, extremely patrilineal society. And you'll remember patrilineal means that the bloodline goes through the male side of the family. In the Nuer community, a man can only pass down property to a son. Okay, he can only pass property to a son. He can't pass it to a daughter. So if a man has no sons, who does he pass property down to? Well, he's not going to pass it down, or likely he's not going to pass it down to a nephew. He's going to want to pass it on to his own kids. You might say, well, he could pass it down to his daughter's husband, but remember, his daughter's husband is not a member of his family. His daughter's husband is a member of his father's family. So what the Nuer do is that in a family where there are no sons and no one for a father to pass property to, one of his daughters may take on the role of being a man. She will symbolically switch genders and continue her adult life as a man. As a man, then, in the society, she will do male work, and she will also marry a woman. because men in this society marry women. So this female husband now takes a wife. This relationship between the female husband and her female wife is symbolic and it's social, but it's not sexual. So this is not an instance where you see a woman becoming a lesbian because she switched genders or something. There's no sexual relationship between these two biologically female women. But any children that are born to the female wife, even though they obviously have no biological connection to the female husband, any children born to the female wife will be considered the legitimate offspring of that female husband. Okay, so it's the male bloodline that's important, but more than that, it's sort of the idea of the male bloodline that's important. So we see here that very strong rules about how property moves and about what family ties are the most important can actually cause a person to switch genders and entering into a same-sex marriage. Obviously, if we're going to talk about marriage, we also have to consider the flip side of it, divorce. Divorce has become very, very common in the United States, and especially over the last several decades. As we see divorce rates increasing since the 1960s, 1970s, we see that the number of single-parent families increases a ton as well. So compared to the 1970s, there are something like 4 times as many single mother families, and single father families have also increased in an incredible amount. We also then have combined families where you have 2 divorced individuals, some with children, marrying each other. So this is a bit of a departure from previous ideas about, what it means to be a nuclear family. We see that the nuclear family structure has been changing in American society. Higher divorce rates also tend to be correlated with female security. What we mean by that is that as women are more able to take care of themselves and take care of their children independent of a husband, they have no longer felt confined to marriage. In the 1930s, let's say, if a woman is unhappy with her marriage, what options did she have? She could choose to get a divorce, and many women did in the past, but options for jobs, options for employment, weren't necessarily that open to women prior to the 1960s and 70s. So women tended to stay in marriages that weren't necessarily the most enjoyable for them because they didn't necessarily have any other options. But as women are able to financially take care of themselves and their children, more of them are choosing to leave marriages. And we can also look at this from the male perspective. Prior to female financial female financial security, many men may have been forced to stay in marriages out of a sense of obligation. Because they were the breadwinners, they knew that leaving a marriage could leave their wives and their children without enough resources. So men have stayed in marriages because of the obligations that they have to the families that they have created. In societies where we see that material wealth is exchanged at the time of marriage, so when bride wealths or dowries are paid at the time of marriage, if divorce were to occur, then those chunks of money would have to be returned to the original family. And if we're talking about a very large sum of money, that's something that might be hard to get your hands on. So we tend to see that when a large amount of money has been exchanged at the time of marriage, there's more of a sort of pressure put on couples to stay together in that marriage. So a high exchange of goods reduces the easiness of getting a divorce. And again, as we said earlier, when people enter into marriages not strictly because of being romantically in love, then the idea of falling out of love, that's not really reasonable grounds for getting a divorce, which is probably why we see a much higher divorce rate in Western countries, where there's greater female economic security, and also people tend to enter marriages because of romantic love. Okay, a couple more terms that we want to work into this conversation. And the first is exogamy. Exogamy is a practice of seeking a mate outside of your own immediate group. And this works, this is not in any way opposed to the other terms that we've already talked about, like matrilocal or matrilineal or plural marriage or anything. This is just another way of talking about how people find mates. So when a person or a community is exogamous, it means that you find a spouse from the next community over, someone outside of your immediate group. And this is practiced by many people because it builds networks between families, it builds networks between communities, and it also increases genetic diversity. So if you imagine a village of maybe 300 people, all farmers working on this land, living there for generation after generation, most of the people in that village are probably going to be related somewhat to each other. So if a group is exogamous, it means they're marrying someone outside of the group who is less likely to be related to them, thereby increasing the genetic diversity of the group. And genetic diversity is a good thing. Bring in some new genes into the mix, make sure that you're not breeding just within your family. This is generally a good practice. And this is a way to avoid low levels of incest. Incest is defined as sexual relations with a relative. Pretty much every community in the world, every culture in the world, have very strong rules against incest. We can definitely see that in the United States. We have very strong cultural reactions to the idea of having sex with a close relative. But what we see when we look around the world is that not everyone defines incest the same way. And that's because not everyone defines family in the same way. So the way that you define family is going to influence the way you define incest. And we can consider, for an example, a group of people called the Locker people from Southeast Asia, and they are a very, very strictly patrilineal society. So again, patrilineal meaning that the bloodline, the important family relationship, goes through the male side of the family. So let's look at an example of a strongly patrilineal society and how that might affect ideas of incest. What we have here is, we're just going to build a little family tree to explain this example. So in anthropology, when we do these family trees or genealogies, men are represented by triangles and females are represented by circles. So we have here a couple, a husband and a wife, and they have a son. Okay, and I've color-coded them so that we can trace these family lines as we build the family tree. In a strongly patrilineal society, children are going to be members of their father's family. So this son here, we will color in blue because he is a member of his father's family. Now let's imagine that these two parents get divorced and they each get remarried. So the father marries a new woman and the mother marries a new man. Now let's imagine that each of these new couples has a child. They each have a daughter. So that's why we have circles here, because we now have two new daughters in the mix. We now want to color code these circles to match up with the bloodlines that are important. So what we will see is that this daughter, because she's in a patrilineal society, she will be considered the same bloodline as her father. This daughter, because we're in a patrilineal society, will be the same bloodline as her father. So we have a girl here in her father's family and a girl here in her father's family. What is the relationship between this son and each of these two women? Well, from a biological standpoint, each of these women is a half-sister to this man because they each share one parent in common. However, in a very, very strongly patrilineal society, these two women are from different families, or they share a different relationship with this individual here. This woman, because she shares a father with this man, they're considered to be members of the same family. They are siblings. So these two individuals could not get married. However, this woman, because she is a member of her father's family, she could get married to this man because they are each members of two different families. And it's as if their shared mother doesn't really pass along her family status whatsoever. So what we can see is that in a very, very strongly patrilineal society, a man could marry his half-sister on his mother's side, and he would not be guilty of incest, even though it's his half-sister. Because she is considered a member of a different family, that type of relationship would be okay. So the way that you define family influences the way you define incest. Some scientists have suggested that there's actually a genetic link to avoid incest, because incest, if we're talking about sexual relations between relatives and children that might result from those sexual relations, what happens when you have relatives reproducing with each other is essentially your gene pool gets smaller and smaller. And so if there are any bad genes in that population, it's more likely that more people in the population have them if all of those people are related. So one of the reasons why you want to increase genetic diversity within a group is you want to bring in good genes from the outside to help swamp out any bad genes that you might have. And we all do this, I mean, we don't realize it, but when we reproduce with our partners, we're sort of entering into this, biological contract where we hope that any bad genes that we have, that our partner has a good gene there. And so that their good gene will be expressed and our bad gene will not. And vice versa. We hope if they have bad genes, that we have good genes in that position and that our good genes will be passed on to our kids. But if we don't have those good genes coming into the population, it means that bad genes might end up getting stuck. And so it's been suggested that there is actually something biological, there's something innate and genetic in us that makes us sexually unattracted to people that we grow up around, basically to siblings. And the reason why we think that there might be some biological component to this is because there are numerous examples where adult siblings grow up completely, like throughout childhood, they never meet, they never interact. They're raised completely apart from one another. But when they meet as adults, they sometimes have a very intense sexual attraction. And this is called genetic sexual attraction. And it happens not all the time, but it happens enough. And it seems as though people who are genetically related, but who don't know each other in childhood, when they meet as adults, it's almost sort of this, they recognize something familiar in each other. And that turns into a very intense sexual attraction. But if you are raised with someone, you view them as a sibling. And then there's this biological part inside of us that says, nope, don't have sex with your sibling because that's not good for the genetic side of things. This is also why sometimes, if we have a next door neighbor or a close family friend who we are raised with, from the time we're teeny tiny babies, we may view them as essentially a sibling. And the thought of engaging in sexual contact with them is disgusting. So you probably know examples, or maybe this has happened to you, where you have a best friend from childhood and you grow up and your parents are like, oh, why don't you and so get together? You guys should get married. You'd be so great together and you've known each other forever. And you look at that person, you're like, no, he's like my brother. I couldn't do that. That's because your biology is essentially tricking you into thinking that that person is your brother, and therefore you should not want to have sex with them. What we see around the world, even though incest is against the rules in essentially every country, every culture, it still does happen. Even though there's a big taboo against it, it still happens, and it still happens quite frequently. So in ancient Egypt, for example, not only did the pharaohs and the elite classes marry siblings or other close relatives as a way of maintaining power, maintaining the purity of a bloodline, but actually up to 1/4 of the general population in ancient Egypt used to marry siblings. So Sibling marriage has been common in some cultures throughout history, and in the United States. Marrying a sibling is illegal, but there are many states here in the US where it is still legal to marry your first cousin. And up until very recently, there were more states where you could legally marry your first cousin than states where you could legally marry someone of the same sex. So even though we have very strong ideas right now about how appropriate it is to have sex or to marry someone that we're related to, there's still a lot of history that sort of supports closer marriages than we might generally consider today. Now, even in exogamous groups where we marry outside of our very immediate community, most cultures practice some form of endogamy. And endogamy is simply marrying someone from your general culture. So, for example, if you were to identify as Greek, then if you were endogamous, you would marry another Greek person. Or if you are Dominican, then being endogamous would mean marrying someone who is also Dominican. A lot of cultures don't have very, very strict rules requiring that people are endogamous, but we still sort of support these ideas. So, maybe if your mother says, why don't you meet someone at church? Like, go to church and you'll meet a nice man there. The reason why, these types of similarities are called on in terms of matching up romantic partners is because people within groups tend to have the same values, tend to have the same cultural traditions, tend to share a language, tend to share a religion. And when we marry inside our own cultural groups, that's how we continue to play our culture forward, right? We often want to marry someone who's similar to us because we see value in the ways that, in our traditions and our cultural values. And so then we pass that on to our children. Some societies have been very, very strongly endogamous, and to the point where there are actually laws surrounding endogamy. So, for example, the caste system in India, which was made illegal in 1949, but this caste system that was in place for a very long time said that you belong to a particular social class from the time that you're born, and it's based on the social class of your parents. And then when you become an adult, you can only marry someone from your social class. Any sort of, and so people wouldn't be allowed to marry someone from a higher social class or from a lower social class. So it limits who you are allowed to marry and who you are allowed to have sexual relationships with. The interesting thing about endogamous systems is that when we see people breaking the rules, when we see people stepping out and either having sex with someone outside of their particular group or marrying someone outside of their particular group, the consequences tend to be different between men and women. So men who break the rules in this particular way, at least during the caste system, men who deviated from the rules would be required to go through, various sort of purification rituals or purification rites. That would include bathing. It might include, staying away from other people for a certain length of time. Women, however, who stepped outside of their particular social classes could have been put to death. And this tends to sort of, this is something that we see a lot, that deviation, especially sexual deviation from whatever the cultural rule is, has much harsher consequences for women than it does for men. And we could probably also start a conversation about ways in which we see that happening, or not, but probably the ways that we do continue to see that happening in the world we live in today, where consequences for breaking the rules as related to sex have much harsher consequences for women than they do for men.